Hello, everybody, and welcome to Let's Scare Jennifer to Death. I am your host, Jennifer Ann Gordon, the author of the Kindle Award-winning novel for Best Horror, Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent, as well as the Best Horror Novel for the Helicon Awards, Pretty Ugly, and the novella series, The Hotel. With me today is author Josh Schlossberg. We are going to be talking about his novella, Malinae. I did it. I sort of said it right. And he is also the editor of the Book of Jewish Horror. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
I am really glad for you to be my first guest back after I've been on a little bit of a hiatus from Let's Scare Jennifer to Death. So thank you.
Cool.
Josh, tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your book, and then we'll get to the Book of Jewish Horror.
About myself. Well, it depends.
Yeah, like all the fun facts.
All the fun facts. Well, I'll give you some
Or
opinions.
two truths and a lie.
Right. Well, I write horror. I write what I call biological horror, which is living creatures, vital processes. So it's a very broad brush. It does include supernatural horror, but there's got to be some way to root it into the physicality of life, just because that's something that always has interested me. Nature, wildlife, creatures, and then just the human body processes, which frighten me. And being human, I find to just be frightening. So things that tie into that. So it doesn't mean I won't have ghosts or demons. I do have all those things, but there's going to be a physical component to it. That's kind of the thing that I consider my brand.
Oh, I love that. I'm petrified of being a human. As a human, I'm petrified of being a human. And medical stuff scares the ever living bejesus out of me. Like, not even weird medical stuff, but just like normal everyday medical stuff, like getting an eye exam. So any type of horror that is like based in our reality, I find so much more frightening than things that are like, I'm fighting a werewolf, or it's, a giant space creature.
Right. It's like, all right, a demon seems scary to me, but it would be more like, what would be the physical feeling of the demon coming into my body? That's the thing that scares me rather than the existence of them.
And I feel like if there was a demon coming into your body or coming out of your body, at that point, you would just be like, the human side of you would be checked out.
True.
But you wrote about Alzheimer's.
Right.
And that is truly horrifying. Like it's something I deal with in my everyday life because of a family member. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the reasons why I picked up your book, because I was just so intrigued by the idea of elder horror, because we hear so much about coming of age horror. But I feel like elder horror is something that hasn't been too tapped into.
Right. It's almost like the flip side of the coming of age. It's like the opposite of Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine, when you're all of a sudden are becoming conscious of, whoa. And then the other version are like, all right, I'm kind of checking out. But yeah, I mean, Alzheimer's is definitely something that frightens me and confuses me. And I also don't take it lightly. My grandmother was suffering from that. She had passed away last year. And my grandfather was dealing with physical ailments, but kind of watching that process unfold. And it really touched me deeply. And I did want to write about it. And so I incorporated that into Malinae, but I brought also a cosmic horror element into it as well, where the Alzheimer's is kind of like the least of the problems.
Yeah. And that I really enjoyed that. I always love it when, especially with like, we'll say medical things or something like Alzheimer's, or I write a lot about like mental illness and addiction and trauma in my horror, and trying to like walk that fine line of, is this a mental illness, or is it a terrible haunting or something like that? Or is it something else, when you have somebody who may or may not have mental illness saying, I swear this isn't me being crazy. I'm not crazy. I'm haunted. Will somebody believe me? So, yeah. So you were close to your grandparents, I'm assuming. Mm-hmm. So the idea was birthed out of watching their relationship. Was part of it also like understanding Alzheimer's or dementia in general, or even the aging process in general, seems so big
Yep.
and so impossible for us as mere humans to understand. Was it easier to give it a cosmic horror element to be able to, in a way, I don't want to say rationalize it, but understand it?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I think that I bring the supernatural stuff in to make me less frightened of my subject matter because if I keep it all on these physical problem stuff, that really concerns me. But then I can kind of distract the reader with like, oh no, don't worry, it's just a
It's just a
Lovecraftian
horrible
thing.
monster.
Right. But then I do. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to give away stuff, but there is a real element of Alzheimer's. And then there is also the other thing going on. And maybe it's a way of coping with the real life horrors. That's why I like reading about demons, or during the pandemic, been watching a lot of stuff around World War II. I'm like, all right, we're not in World War II, so it's not as bad. And so for me, it's almost a coping mechanism, and maybe as a way of like, all right, you come back at the end and you're like, okay, well, there are still these real life problems, but I think we can cope with them. We conquered this other thing.
Yeah, you said something, and I had to laugh because I've told this to people, and I say it all the time. I'm like, I use horror and true crime and things like that as a coping mechanism myself. Like,
Sure.
there's like some sort of self-soothing that I get when I read about a demon. Like, it actually calms me
Yeah.
when I'm
It's
thinking about like the rest of the real world, and those are like real life panic attacks I have. And then I'm just like, nope, I'm just going to read this book about a demon. Like, burrowing into somebody's eyeball, and that makes me feel better.
it works for me as well. Yeah. I don't know if it's a displacement or if it's like really getting to the deeper parts of fear and then you can sort of reprocess it. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's a way of making us stronger. So we practice with maybe these heavy weights of interstellar creatures and ghosts or whatever. So then we're like, all right, well, I can handle this here.
I can
And
handle seeing a spider in my shower if I can, like, rationalize that I could fight a demon if I really had to.
that could well be it. Yeah, it definitely does help me. And I use sense of humor around a lot of horrible things. Like I'll make jokes. I try to gauge my audience, of course, and don't worry, I'm not going to say anything here, but I make some
I was
pretty,
going to say, don't get, you're like,
I make
I'm
some
going to
very
try to
dark.
get myself canceled.
No, I won't. See, I'm self-aware enough to know to just to censor myself in advance, but I make dark jokes a lot, not because I'm like, this doesn't matter. It's like, no, I am literally trying to, well, not literally, but making light of that thing because it's such a difficult thing. It's the only way for me to process is to laugh at the absurdity and
Yeah.
to kind of maybe not laughing at the horror, although I do try to incorporate that into my horror, but to get super scared of a thing that isn't the thing kind of works. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it does. 'Cause I mean, I consider myself, I don't want to say incredibly neurotic, but like a slightly neurotic person. I'm anxious about stuff. So like if I lay in bed and like honestly think about time or even just like really think about the aging process, I will like work myself up into a panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ridiculous. It's like a ridiculous thought when I'm like laying there in bed and everything's perfectly fine. We have a fire on, my little dog is laying next to me, everything's great. And I'm just like, what would happen if I woke up in a coffin? You know? And then like it's in my head and I'm thinking,
Sure.
what if that really could happen? I'm like, no, that doesn't happen anymore. Does it happen? Can it
Right.
happen? Then I'm like Googling, like, do people still get buried alive? And of course they do.
Barely, but yeah.
Barely, but they still sometimes do. So that's when I reach for horror novels instead.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like our brains want something to chew on, so give them something. And it's like, here, ghosts, demons, here, vampires, here, werewolves. So now you're not obsessing over this stuff. And that's why I think I write, is because my mind is always churning, churning, churning. And it's like, all right, here, it's like a dog that needs to bite something. It's like, here's the bone.
Are you one of those writers that's like, I write because it's cheaper than therapy?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that's why I started writing as a kid, is just I would have emotions and I would just write it out. And then somehow I felt better afterwards. So I was like, all right, well, this kind of works.
What is the first thing, maybe kind of like fiction wise, that you remember writing when you were a kid? And how terrible was it?
It definitely, everything I wrote sucked. and maybe still to this day, who knows? But I would say I remember writing synopses of existing horror movies. So that didn't really count, but it was a way of sort of like writing about a thing that I had watched. And so that was my first hand at that. I remember it was a movie called The Green Slime. It was some sort of black and white B movie from maybe the 60s, maybe, I don't remember. And it was just about going to outer space and bringing back some sort of jello, and then it turns into a monster. And I remember writing about it for my class and just really enjoying that. So that doesn't count. I didn't write that story, but
Yeah, I still love that you wrote that for a class, because in sixth grade, I wrote like Nightmare on Elm Street fan fiction for a class. I had never actually seen the movies, but I'd seen the previews a lot. And I was like obsessed. So I just like wrote this like Freddy Krueger and Nancy, like kind of like rom-com.
nice.
Like, and I turned it in, and I remember my teacher didn't give me a grade. He just wrote no on it and
No,
like just like handed it back like, yeah, you don't need to write anything else. Like, it's fine. It's not going to be held against you, but like, this isn't what I was looking for.
that's too bad. They should stoke creativity wherever you
I
find it.
wish I had that now, because I just remember it being awful, but like overly gory too. Like I'm shocked that if it happened today, I think he would have like called my parents, and there would have been a really big meeting with like counselors and and like, it just, why did you write about all that stabbing on the school bus, Jennifer?
Yeah, people get uptight about that stuff, I guess. But, if you're writing fan fiction about a film, I mean, that's a very creative process, and that's a really good thing. So
Yeah, I
keep,
didn't even understand it was fan fiction. Basically, I was just stealing somebody else's idea and writing like Nightmare on Elm Street 3 or 4 or whatever it was at that time that hadn't come out yet.
I think that's how it starts. That's great. Yeah, I didn't do a ton of writing when I was younger. Even in high school, I definitely started writing poetry, and I would write some songs because I play guitar, and I would write some stuff for school. And I do remember that my English teacher, he handed back some crazy thing that I wrote once, and he's like, "Did you smoke your breakfast?" That's what I remember his comments being. I don't remember what it was that I wrote, but
Was this when you lived in Vermont?
no. So I grew up in New York State, so
Okay.
no, I wasn't smoking anything. But
On the record, you were not smoking anything.
mhm, mhm.
You're like, I was a very good student.
I was associate. I was a decent student when I was interested, but yeah, it wasn't like I was writing. I was like, clearly going to be a writer all the time. But I would write a lot, and I had a facility for it. It seems like it did come easy to me to a certain degree, so that helps. It's just having like a little spark there, so it came easy. It just sort of would flow. But so far as the creative output I had was nothing to speak of, I would say.
I know sometimes I talk to people and they're like, I wrote 14 novels before I was 20. I'm like,
Right.
whoa, I did
No,
not do that. I
no,
wrote a
just
ton of bad poetry before I was
yeah, I
20.
would write some stuff that dabbled in horror, maybe dark fantasy. It was a lot about kind of, yeah, like Lord Dunsany sort of stuff, influenced by Lovecraft, but not quite horror. And then in college, I started to write more actual horror in our creative writing classes. But yeah, really until about 10 years ago did I start seriously focusing on writing horror fiction and getting my stories published.
So was there like an inciting incident that flipped the switch in you that made you go from I'm just dabbling in writing to I'm going to write?
I just didn't like any other jobs I've had. So I wanted to incorporate writing. And so I've done lots of different kinds of work. But I think the shift was when I sort of stepped back from, I was an environmental organizer actually working for nonprofits. And I was writing a little bit here and there, but I stepped back from that. And I was like, let me see if I can really make more of a go at the writing thing. And it's not my main career or anything. I do other work for sure, but I decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to be serious. I want to spend more time, and I need to get better at this by writing more and then learning the whole process of getting stuff out there, which I still find very distasteful.
It's, I feel like as a writer, like our writer brain can only do, like we're either actively writing, we're in that creative zone, or then you become this person who's like querying
Yeah.
and submitting, and that's like a completely different part of my brain. Yeah, that part. I'm taking actually a wonderful class this entire month. It's every single morning. I don't do every morning, but it's every morning, and it's about submitting to like literary journals. And every morning there's a different editor there saying, giving the class like their opinion of like what they look for, what makes a query stand out, what makes a submission stand out. And it's awesome. It's run by the instructor Diane Zinna, but it's I've been doing this for a while, and it's overwhelming every day where I'm like, I'm going to submit to this journal, and then the editor comes and I'm like, I'm not ready to submit to that journal, and you want what? It has
Right.
to be how many words? And I'm like looking at my perfect piece, and I'm like, that's not so perfect anymore.
Well, according to them, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's that whole process. It is definitely using a different part of the brain, which we writers might not always be as good at. But as I started to do some editing, I started to see kind of that other side of that world, which it's been interesting to be on that other side. Although I much prefer writing. I
Well, I was going to ask because you are the editor of it is the Book of Jewish Horror.
the Jewish Book of
The
Horror.
Jewish Book of Horror.
I thought about it. I'm like, no, but I thought about the Book of Jewish, and I was like, no, let's put Jewish first.
Just put
Then I
a
decided the Jewish
Jewish
Book
Book
of
of
Horror.
No, that's better. That it should be the Jewish Book of Horror. So you are the editor of that. So it was like your turn to be like, haha, send me your submissions.
Yeah, it's mostly a vengeance
I was
project.
going to say, is it like very Old Testament? I
Just I rejected every single author, and then I just had all my stories in there.
was going to say, really, it's just a different novel by you.
No, it was yeah, it was not something that I don't know. Sometimes I feel compelled to do things, and the idea came to me. I had been the lead editor of an anthology for Denver Horror Collective. It's this entity I helped establish back in 2017 of a bunch of horror authors. We also have a publishing house, and Terror at 5280 was all Colorado stories by Colorado authors, and we got Stephen Graham Jones in it, which was pretty awesome.
Yeah,
And
that's not too bad of a get.
no, it was pretty great. An original story in there, and a lot of other great folks. And I was the lead editor on that, so I didn't do all of it, but all the stories came through me. So that was my first practice at that. And the book did really well. It was a Denver Post bestseller, won an award. And then I did some copy edits for the next anthology, Consumed Tales Inspired by the Wendigo. That was Henry and Holly Snyder edited that, but I did copy edits. So I was homing my craft of making sure all the words and punctuation and everything was in place. I didn't do the content editing. That was all Henry and Holly. And then I was like, I think I might be ready for this next one. I had this idea. I was while talking with my mom. I'm like, let me see, has anyone else done it? And one person had done a small Jewish horror anthology, John Baltusberger, and I spoke to him about it. And I was like, can I steal your idea? Even though, I mean, I also independently, but whatever. I wanted to have him involved with the process.
Yeah.
And, he did help advise, and he wrote a story for it. And so we just did a little bit larger scale of it. And that's basically what happened.
So how big was like what was the response for submissions? Were you overwhelmed with it, or was it a closed submission so you just asked?
No, it was open submissions. I mean, we didn't post it everywhere, but we posted it enough places, and we got, I think it was around like 80 something submissions, which,
That's great.
well, for Jewish horror
I
specifically,
was going to say that's a very niche
right.
call that you've put out there. That's why I'm like, good job.
Yeah, it was surprising the amount of submissions for that, because a lot of non-Jewish authors who we did include some non-Jewish authors in the book. I definitely wanted to have those perspectives as well. A lot of non-Jewish authors would be a little bit intimidated to even try to write Jewish horror, even though we put in the call, you don't have to be Jewish. It is primarily Jewish authors, but not entirely. The only requirement was some connection to the Jewish culture. It could just be you researched a lot or whatever. So what's interesting is the non-Jewish authors who we ended up choosing their stories, a lot of times their stories are better researched. Like Jews like me who just grandfathered in were like, yeah, I know enough. But folks who are not Jewish, like, I need to
They're
get
like,
this right.
it has to be right. It cannot be offensive. I have to know what I'm saying.
Right. And so that's how that ended up working out. And yeah, it was lots of fun. The editing process, I kind of enjoy that. I like going through pretty much every story that was submitted was quite good. And that's the thing I learned about my own fiction. So I rejected excellent stories, like excellent stories, excellent concept, because okay, we already have a story that's similar to this, and that
Yeah.
aspect was included. So it's not just about the quality of your writing, it's not just about what's in your story, it's sometimes whether it just fits into the anthology, and then my personal tastes, which are
Yeah.
totally subjective.
So that must have really made you, as like writer Josh, pure writer brain Josh, feel better sending your work out there and getting those rejection letters that are like, hey, this was great, but it was just not a good fit. Now all of a sudden in your head you're like, oh, that actually doesn't mean that I suck.
Right, but no, definitely. So that did help to be like, okay, this is so based on personal preference, and it can be just about, this was one of the best written stories I've seen. Sorry, it just doesn't fit into the thing. But I also learned that the editor, myself, can get lazy and just sort of look for problems that aren't there because you just want to get done with it. And I had to make myself over and over again, like, just because we're at the end of the submissions period does not mean I'm just going to, look for a problem and get rid of it. I had to stop myself several times. So now I know probably a lot of editors do that. So
Yeah,
now
because
I
they're
have,
probably like, gosh, I've already accepted 11 stories and we can only accept 12 and I have 50 more to read.
right. And you almost don't want the next story to be better, because then you'll have to
Because then you
rethink
have to
your process.
redo everything.
So
Ah,
there is that's the shadow of it. And I learned it. So it's both made me less resentful of when I send out stories, and also like, I wonder why you really rejected this. But
I know. Did you
whatever.
reject it because you were tired from already reading? Did you reject it because you already got your quota, but you still had all these other stories left? Was
Could
I
be any
just,
of that. But that's the thing. It's the editor's baby. It's up to them. It's really just about personal preference. There's no like, this is the best of a thing. It's just, this is the thing I like most. And the concept of kill your darlings, right? In your writing, like, oh, this is a cool little concept, I want to shove this
yeah,
in my story. It doesn't fit. Sometimes that's with some of the stories. I was like, this is the
yeah.
best written story. It's such a cool, but we already have 9 rabbis, so we can't do any more rabbis. Sorry. And we can only pick one golem
I was
story.
going to say, how many golem stories did you have, though?
Well, we got several submissions, and that was the toughest part, because I had to include a golem story,
You
but I
had to.
wanted to trick people a little bit. So you'll probably be tricked by the golem story.
I
So that's,
Well,
and
I
then
like to hear
there's a double trick. You'll see.
You're like, you'll see. I
There's
know
some
you have it.
tricks. I like
Perfect.
to I like to trick people, and some people don't like being tricked, but I love being tricked.
I love being tricked. I love it. I love a twist and a trick that you go, oh, I didn't see that coming. And not because it's outlandish and the
Right.
author just went, oh, I'm just going to do a twist and it's not going to make any sense.
Right.
Like, come on.
No, I
Don't
like the
M. Night
reveal.
Shyamalan me.
No, that's a little much, but like the gradual reveal, I do tend, in my earlier fiction for sure, and maybe still to this day, I tend to hide stuff a little too much. So I'm trying to get a little bit better at, you don't have to hide, pulling your punches. Sometimes you got to tell people what's going
Sometimes
on.
you need to, yeah, I'm on a second/third draft of a project that does have a significant twist that I understood, but not during my first draft. But then my second draft, I understood the twist, but I'm like, I still want it to be quite a shock. And then when I was rereading it, I'm like, no, it's too buried. You know what's going on in your
Right.
characters' heads. The reader needs to know a little bit about what's going
It's
on in their
tough
heads.
because today it's almost like you have to start with the bang. It's like people want the explosion right in the beginning. And personally, I like that less. Like, I actually prefer kind of the older fiction where here's the setting, just deal with it.
Yeah. And what's funny is, so in horror, I prefer here's the setting, deal with it. Let's have a slow, weird burn. Like, that's what I want in my horror. But
Mm,
if I write, like, if I'm reading or like a thriller or crime, I sometimes love, like, just
sure.
open with the dead body,
Understand
open
that.
with the
Yeah.
crime, tell me about it later. But horror, I want to live in that world and I
Right.
want to be completely unsettled before I really even understand what's happening.
Yeah, I've tried to compromise a bit in my writing. So like I'll give people stuff up front to tide them over, but the bigger reveals I definitely want until later. But I don't know. I'm thinking my next book, which so I just finished writing another novel, and then I didn't want to start working on another one, but I'm already getting these ideas, and so I'm writing a short story that might take place in that novel world as sort of
Oh, I
an
love that.
attempt. But I'm going to try to do the opposite of what I always do, which is like the slow reveal. I'm going to kind of like start with like, here is what is going on. Okay, here you go, people. Is this like I look at it like the Breaking Bad thing, like the beginning of Breaking Bad, they're like, oh, and then the thing is on fire. That's the first scene, and then
Yep.
kind of we'll explain some of that stuff. So we're living in a world where, yeah, for it's and even for like awards or reviews, stuff like that, people are looking at the beginning, and if
Yep.
you don't grab them right away, so I'm like, all right, I'll play that game. I got to grab you right away. I'll probably not grab you with what is ultimately going to be the big dark
The big
stuff,
thing.
but I'll
Yep.
grab you with something. I'll show you that I can keep your attention and everything like that.
I love that you just said that. Yeah, the project I'm working on, my like 2.5/3 revisions, for the first time I did I'm going to start with something. I'm going to start with somebody going, "Oh, are
Right.
we at the end?" And me
Yeah.
going, "Oh, we're not really at the end." And that's not the
Cool.
big twist, but again, it was like that's not how I normally write, and maybe I've just consumed so much horror, crime, thriller in my
Sure.
head right now that I'm like, I'm going to give the people what they want. I'm going to give them somebody almost dead on page 1.
I mean, it's not a bad thing. Obviously, it's not like compromising your art to just understand what the styles of the day. So I think about that stuff, and I like to tinker, try different things. But yeah, the slow. I mean, I don't like the term slow burn because it
It
sounds
sounds,
negative.
it does. It sounds like, and I know people say to me, they're like, "Oh, your book's a slow burn." And I'm like, "Thank you." But then you get the review that's like, "This was too much of a slow burn. Nothing happened for 150 pages." And you're like, "A lot happened.
Right.
Weather, the house creaked weird, the mirror was strange." Like, a
Right. Well,
lot
I do think
happened.
people have less attention span. Like I'm reading a book right now called Incubus by Anne Ahrensberg, which I've had around for a while in my house. And I decided about 2 weeks ago that it was time for me to pick it up and read it. And then I found out she died like 2 days before I started reading the book because I
That
decided to
gives
look
me
up her name.
chills.
I know. And there was another, I was listening to Meatloaf. I watched a Meatloaf documentary too a few weeks ago, and then he died. So I don't know what's
I
going
was
on.
talking about Meatloaf the night before he died, and I was like, I have too much control over the universe.
Well, maybe both our combined powers, we ended up doing that.
I mean, so like, and I don't know, this is probably like just like the horror thing that happens to horror writers that like you do something and then something bad happens and you're like, did I do that with my head? Is that my brain? Did I
It's
do that?
probably unlikely, but entirely possible. But
I mean,
this
we've all read Carrie. She didn't know what she was doing.
it's a very this would be a very weird superpower to have. But yeah,
I
we
know. Like if I think about a celebrity too much, they end up
they
dying.
die. Yeah. Well, there's so many celebrities that's
There's
going to
so many
happen
of them.
sooner or later. But this book Incubus, it's very well written. I'm most of the way through. It was, lauded in all the official places and stuff like that. But I don't think you here's the thing. If I wrote a book this slow, I wouldn't have a chance. So this was in like 2000. So I'm most of the way through, and we just sort of saw the thing that it's about
Yeah.
after like 200 something pages. And so, part of me is almost like, yeah, look how popular this was back in the day. I don't know how popular it was, but it was popular enough.
I like
I
that you
don't,
said back in the day, and I'm like, but that was only 2000. And I'm like,
but
oh, that's 22 years
it's,
ago.
it's
And I'm old.
changed. It's changed a lot. It seems, but it's interesting. So I a lot of times will read the older school stuff because I kind of like that suspenseful rather than slow burn, however you want to frame it. But
Yeah.
I think it might have influenced my work a little too much. So I'm trying to, get with the times a little bit more.
Get with the times. Josh, you're young. Don't worry. I'd be
Um,
like, I've got to write for them kiddos.
well,
Um,
then my protagonist is 86 years old because I secretly feel 86 years old
I
sometimes.
will say that was the thing I loved about your book because I was like, okay, it's elder horror. And I just assumed that it was going to be about either like a child taking care of a parent or like a younger healthcare worker or something like that. And then like bam, page one, I'm like, oh, protagonist is 86. Yes.
I didn't do it as a deliberate thing, as in like, oh, there should be more diversity in horror, which I do support, but like we need to have a varying but I was just thinking about the whole Alzheimer's situation from my grandfather's perspective and sort of seeing the changes in my grandmother and how difficult that would be for not just her, but for him to cope with
Yeah.
his conscious mind, much less, her, who knows, obviously she was suffering to a certain degree, but she had kind of a light, slow touch of it. So
Yeah.
it wasn't terrifying. It seemed like for her, and then sort of she, then it declined quickly at the end, and then she passed away.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was horrific it's hard to say. I know it was pretty horrific for my grandfather who was
You
just
know,
there
it's
watching
much
this.
it's much harder, I think, on the caregivers. So my mom has Lewy body dementia, which is a type of Alzheimer's, that also involves hallucinations and fun
Mm,
things like that. But she is very happy.
hmm
She's like just living her life,
hmm
doesn't know her words anymore sometimes, but like she's content.
Right.
And yet I'm the one who's like, oh my gosh. And
Yeah.
every once in a while, I just have to like do a deep breath and like look at my mom and be like, she's happy. She's petting the cat.
Right.
She's fine.
Right. We're
Like,
writing all this stuff on, oh, she's not how she
she's
should
this.
be. And
Yeah.
she's how she is. She's still her. And
Yeah.
obviously I don't want to suggest that like it feels great to be in that situation, but
Yes. For people who are watching this or listening to this, we are not saying people with Alzheimer's love it.
no,
So that's not the takeaway.
no, but all I know
That's not the
is
takeaway, Twitter.
the hyper conscious brain that is always, conjuring up new problems to think about. Maybe it's possible that part starts getting turned off a little bit. But the truth is, a lot of people with Alzheimer's, they are anxious because they're confused. And so I'm sure
Yes.
it's no walk in the park. And I'm glad that they're working on more cures, but it does seem to be a part of the human condition. And I believe coping with it is important. And in my writing, it's like, I want to investigate the shadow and come through into the light. And it's not a light without shadow. It's not this pure celestial light. It's going to be a little bit of both.
Well, Josh, you just said something profound. So I feel like we should end there because it was like, whoa, that was great. I shouldn't ask like a weird question after that. That was amazing. Josh, thank you for being here on Let's Scare Jennifer to Death.
Thank you.
Everybody who's watching the video, Josh's website and his book information is scrolling underneath us. It's also going to be in the show notes. Make sure to run out to your computer and buy Malinae.
Mm-hmm.
I said it different times. Both times I've said it, and both times are correct.
That's good.
Is what Josh and I discussed before the show.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you everybody for watching. Stay tuned. Let's Scare Jennifer to Death has some great upcoming guests, including Josh Darling, including Philip Fracassi, sorry, edit that part out. Philip Fracassi. And we will see you all soon. Thank you. Raving.